Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. While some in Ukraine want to join the EU, a recent poll shows that 52% of French workers want to leave the euro, and that only 34% of them think the EU is a good thing. Only one of these two groups is right. Either being an EU member is horrible or it's a good thing. The fact that we don't know is a market failure, for until we can let free participants in the EU market give us a price signal, then we don't know the value of membership. Seems logical, Stacey.
Well, a lot of it seems to come down to trade deals. Remember, it was a trade deal that Yanukovych had backed out of in the Ukraine, which caused some people to come out into the streets and be upset. Well, in the EU right now, they're looking to secretly negotiate a trade deal with the United States called TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership deal. Well, EU-US trade talks face growing hostility, ministers warn. Free trade talks between the United States and EU are in danger of being derailed by populist groups opposing everything from globalization to multinationals. This is how they describe this, Max. They're calling them populist. And the exact quote from the Finnish minister is, "We are grappling with people who are anti-European, who are anti-American, who are anti-free trade, who are anti-globalization, and who are anti-multinational corporations." That's Finland's Minister for Europe and Trade, Alexander Stubb, and this is what he told the EU ministers.
Well, the grand arc of history has gone through periods of globalization and deglobalization. Prior to World War I was a period of high globalization, and then you had World War I, which was obviously a period of deglobalization, a lot of bloodshed. So here we are at the precipice once again. I think clearly, given the current over-financialization of the global economy and the reliance on 0% interest rates, which cannot possibly go on into infinity, we are looking at, once again, a period of deglobalization, which is inevitable given the kind of the arc of history. So no policymakers can get in the way of this. It's just the kind of the cycles that are tied to concentration of power. When a few people have an inordinate concentration of power like they do now in Europe, in the United States, and around the world due to financialization and globalization, they invariably set up a period where it goes bust in something called deglobalization. And I think that's the period we're at now.
Well, the other thing that's interesting about this is, first of all, this is a trade deal, the TTIP, is it's done in secret, so no citizens, voters, taxpayers of the EU are actually able to look at it. The only reason why we know anything about it is some of it has been leaked by WikiLeaks, so people were able to see some of it. That this would also, what we've seen is that it would create a new third layer of judiciary only for the corporations, and that they would have power over your nations. So a lot of people are now fighting over national borders and sovereignty and issues like that, where here it's removed for everybody. There's no fighting. There's no fighting because it's a secret court somewhere that you don't know about. There's nowhere to go and storm that building in that eventuality. And the other thing is that here they are condemning the very people and their own taxpayers, their own citizens, who don't want the same deal that basically that Yanukovych didn't sign. Here they're calling them anti-American, anti-European, anti-globalization, anti-multinational corporation.
Right. Well, it's a train wreck of trade deals that are overlapping each other in ways that are completely counterproductive and counterintuitive and can't possibly last. And so here you have a situation where the TTIP, it's not free trade. Let's get that clear. It's not about free trade. It's anti-free trade. The supporters of TTIP are saying that the critics are anti-free trade, but that's just calling the kettle black. They're just making that up as part of their propaganda. TTIP is anti-free trade because it supports over-concentration of wealth and resources in the fewer and fewer and fewer hands. That's not free trade. That's neo-feudalism.
Well, that's exactly the point I was going to make at this finally here on this story, because they say that these guys negotiating the secret pact are claiming that it will generate $100 billion in additional economic output a year on both sides of the Atlantic. But since the financial crisis, it's something like 97% of the gains have gone to the top 1%. So what they're saying is it'll create $97 billion more for the oligarchs that run everything.
Exactly. It'll create another $97 billion of wealth for the oligarchs, the very small percentage of folks that are putting these deals together. They also don't mention that it's $100 billion worth more of trade and another $600 to $700 billion more debt They never tell you the debt. Like the UK, for example, is at historic debt levels. They don't mention that when they talk about the so-called growth.
One of the ministers in the article actually says, people are concerned about Monsanto in particular, even though that's in the trade deal, the secret trade deal that we saw about this copyright cartel and the intellectual property rights. They're saying, we won't allow it, however, in the EU. So why is it in the trade deal? So they're already lying to you. Now, speaking of being lied to, there's Anatol Levin, who is an author, a journalist, and a policy analyst at the New American Institute. And he is over in the Ukraine. And this is what he said about one of the worst things. He's assigning blame everywhere, essentially. But he said the thing that the EU and the US have done wrong is this in particular. After years of demanding that successive Ukrainian governments undertake painful reforms in order to draw nearer to the West is now in a paradoxical position. If it wishes to save the new government from a Russian-backed counter-revolution, it will have to forget about any reforms that will alienate ordinary people and instead give huge sums in aid with no strings attached. The EU has allowed the demonstrators in Kiev to believe that their actions have brought Ukraine closer to EU membership. But if anything, this is now even further away than it was before the revolution. So he's saying that they're going to have to give the Ukrainians, if they want to not make them angry and come protest against them, basically money with no strings attached, unlike what Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Spain have had.
So again, I'm saying that the EU finds itself in this position of having to put together deals that are self-defeating and self-repudiating in the face of a growing population that is unrestful, to put it in those terms, civil unrest. So they are compounding the social cohesion risk, as it's called, or the revolt risk, or the people in the street throwing rocks risk, by putting out a series of deal memos and other documents into the public domain that are completely canceling each other out in a way that, oh my God, only a few people are getting rich. And because of the internet, because of the trends toward deglobalization, which is the internet's all about deglobalization in many ways, these people are now having to face the possibility of being hoisted by their own petard.
Even more anti-Euro, Eurosceptic than the French are the Greeks. In fact, I believe they're number one. No, they're number two, only to the UK, which is more Eurosceptic. So here's a headline from Greece this week to see how they have fared under IMF, Troika sort of restrictions on their freedom. Home ownership in Greece's sick joke as property market collapses. Since the outbreak of the Greek debt crisis 4 years ago, property values nationwide have dropped by around 32%, according to the Bank of Greece. Estate agents contracted by The Guardian estimated the decline at near 50%. So not only have house prices declined the second most in all of Europe, but now it's considered a sick joke to even own property that you might pass to your children. The situation is so dire that home ownership, at nearly 87%, the highest in the EU, has become cause for black humor. The joke now doing the rounds is, if you want to punish your children, you threaten to pass on property to them. Greeks traditionally have always regarded property as a secure investment, but now it's become a huge millstone, given that the tax burden has increased sevenfold in the past 2 years alone.
This is an example of deglobalization as well, because let's look at it in this context. Up until the year 2008, the world was rising up on a rising tide of fiat money driven by 0% interest rates. But now since 2008, the tide's been going out in a deglobalized way, which means that the financialization has also been decelerating. So a country like Greece, this is where you're seeing the money being pulled out and the property values are collapsing as a proof, as an example of deglobalization. If Greece were going to be part of the globalized world, then that spigot of cash would not have been turned off to Greece. So this is happening in all these peripheral countries, and it's happening within countries. It's happening within Ukraine. It's happening within the Eurozone. It's happening within the United States. If you're not on the wrong side of the apartheid wall, the interest rate apartheid wall, then you're being deglobalized forcefully by having the money taken away from you. So this is all happening. The people who are least aware of this are the folks that are benefiting still from all the free money printing, like John Kerry, who makes like ludicrous statements. When John Kerry, the Secretary of State, talks, it's like listening to a star from 30 years ago that his speech just arrived on planet Earth 30 years later. Because what he's saying, the context, the The paradigm that John Kerry speaks of in describing Ukraine and other issues of geopolitical importance was irrelevant 30 years ago. He's not even in the 21st century anymore.
Also here in Greece. So you could see their situation since joining the euro. First, it looked really nice. Their lifestyles are very nice down there in Greece. And it's collapsed. You go there now, and it's homelessness everywhere. It's people without any health care at all now. Hospitals without even any pharmaceuticals or equipment because nobody will send them stuff. So the only thing at this moment keeping the Greeks afloat is they're basically selling EU residency. So in the article points this out, is that they're selling residency for 250,000 euros, which they advertise as being better than what Spain and Portugal are selling for 500,000 euro. So they're selling their EU residency, and this is the only hope, is actually putting a price on what that residency might be worth.
Yeah, well, presumably after the Titanic hit the iceberg, somebody was trying to sell their first-class cabins. To anybody willing to fork over some bucks. But I'm not sure that's a great buy.
No, but in terms of their incomes as well in Greece, those have declined rapidly as well, so making it harder to pay these tax burden of the sevenfold increase in taxes.
So you can buy an asset that's guaranteed to go down in value while you're losing money on the income stream. Hey, that sounds like Hank Paulson or Ben Bernanke. Oh, he's gone. Janet Yellen, get her into on this deal. She's going to be all over it.
Well, just take a look at this quick chart here as well. This is from Hans Rosling, a Swedish professor. And he said that in 1953 that GDP per capita in Ukraine equaled Japan. Today, its GDP per capita is lower than that of China. So this partly explains the unrest. People are unhappy they're earning less income, but so are the people in Greece and Spain and Portugal, where there's 50% youth unemployment, higher than 50% youth unemployment, by the way.
Yeah, why are they jumping over to Europe, where it's exploding and deflating and deglobalizing, instead of sticking with a known gas producer? I don't know.
And of course, China. The heading east. East is the direction that things are going. East is the direction that gold is going. East is the direction that Bitcoin is going. East is the direction that silver is going. East is the direction that all of our jobs from the EU and US went.
Go east, young man. Thank you, Stacy.
I'm heading east. No, that's west. East.
Stay tuned for the second half. We've got a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Costa Rica and speak with Dmitry Orlov, author of Collapse Gap and also of Reinventing Collapse. Dmitry, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Great to be with you, Max.
All right, Dmitry, you were born in Russia, moved to the U.S. when you were 12. So you understand both views on this Ukraine crisis. First, tell us the economic story that triggered the situation in Ukraine and what the fallout is today.
Well, Ukraine was stuck in this idiotic tug of war between the European Union and the Customs Union, which is a sort of Soviet Union light, if you will. It's basically a way of making the former Soviet territory more or less function as a borderless entity with regard to trade. The European Union wanted Ukraine in its fold for political reasons largely, but really wasn't able to offer it anything. And facing bankruptcy, the Ukrainian government turned to Moscow for help, and Moscow obliged with admission to the customs union and with some $15 billion of pledged support, but that upset the West. And so in this tug of war, basically whatever consensus existed in Ukraine was destroyed, and this allowed a bunch of neo-Nazis to dive into the breach and take over the government, and basically take over parliament and have the parliament do whatever it wants, basically at gunpoint, which is not a legitimate state of affairs. But unfortunately, the United States and Brussels decided to recognize this new neo-Nazi regime in Kiev and make it its own, precipitating the next stage of the crisis.
All right. What are the specifics of the EU trade deal which Yanukovych refused to sign, and what happens from here?
Well, basically, the Ukrainian economy is non-competitive with the West. If you just throw it open to open competition, it would pretty much not be able to compete. The only way the Ukrainians, without a massive modernization that would cost many tens or maybe hundreds of billions, the only way it can function is with cheap Russian energy. The only way to get at that cheap Russian energy below market is to enter into the customs union. So Yanukovych, he's not very smart, by the way, but he was able to recognize that entry into the European Union, throwing the Ukrainian economy open to competition within the EU, is basically the quickest road to bankruptcy imaginable, and that the only way he could actually keep the whole thing afloat would be to strike a deal with Moscow. Unfortunately, this did not sit well with the US State Department or with Brussels.
Right, now the IMF and the EU is what they've got. The new prime minister has called for budget cuts. The Greek, Spanish, Portuguese, and French write occasionally against austerity. How will the Ukrainians take it, if you get what I'm getting at here? You already have a template in the Greek and other countries for what's going on in the Eurozone. How are the Ukrainians going to take to this?
Well, Ukraine, except for a few oligarchs who are fabulously rich, is already quite austere. So it's very hard to impose cuts on something that's already been cut and hollowed out, etc. That said, there's still quite a lot of stuff to be sold within Ukraine. You could pretty much, anything that's not bolted down can be carted away and, sold to the Chinese to smelt down or whatever. There's still plenty of dirt there that's high quality dirt that can be exported. Lots of stuff. People can be sold into slavery. That's probably, the biggest profit center as far as privatizing all of Ukraine. The people can be sold into slavery.
That reminds me of a couple of years ago in Ireland during the height of the crisis. They were selling Irish peat to Americans by the bag. So you could have real Irish dirt in your own backyard. Now, the Svoboda Party is part of the government, but their policy platform calls for the nationalization of enterprise and for ending privatization. Are they likely to achieve this plan?
No, not at all. The more likely, on the lunatic fringe of European politics, which seems to be in charge now, the more likely developments have to do basically with bigotry, with denying Russians their linguistic and cultural rights, maybe finding some Jews to attack, maybe some pogroms, things like that. But they're not really, they're not likely to spearhead some new economic initiative.
Now, Dmitry, the British journalist, author, and policy analyst Anatol Lieven says that Ukraine is further from EU membership now than they were before the revolution due to economic devastation. So, your thoughts?
Well, why would a mostly agrarian country with an ancient, largely obsolete industrial base that is connected, very much connected to the Russian industrial base, why would it want to enter EU? Its only way forward, really, is with Russia, as it has always been, as a component of the Russian industrial machine. That is really the only way it can continue to exist as a developed society. If it enters the EU, then it is automatically bankrupt, automatically non-competitive. Nobody is going to give it the hundreds of billions of euros it would take it to modernize. It doesn't really have the legal apparatus. That is, quickly becoming destroyed. It's a very corrupt place. So it just really doesn't stand a chance in the EU at all.
All right, now, Dmitry Orlov, of course, you came to prominence with your essay's Collapse Gap and the follow-up to that essay, talking about how basically the arms race between America and Soviet Union has bankrupted both countries, with the Soviet Union going bust first, and the U.S. is kind of going through a slow-motion collapse over the past 20 years. What can we glean from this current Ukraine crisis that would relate to the collapse gap theory? How do you fit it into your paradigm?
Well, on the one hand, this is an ongoing set of rolling collapses. Basically, to keep the core, the Western economic core from collapsing, it's important to continue destroying countries. So we destroyed Iraq, we destroyed Libya, we destroyed Syria, now we're destroying Ukraine. And the thing is that basically whenever we destroy a country, the result is massive wealth destruction, but it occurs somewhere other than in the economic heartland, allowing the economic heartland to continue to exist. At some point, we will run out of countries to destroy, or they will turn out to be too difficult to destroy. So that's one side of the collapse story. The other side of the collapse story is collapses run their course, and then sometimes you have resurgence. So Russia has gone through its collapse experience. That ran its course by the late 1990s when Putin took over, and has since been resurgent. So there's this fringe of Russian Federation, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, which is inhabited by Russians, and the Russians got stuck on the wrong side of the border, be it in the Ukraine, be it in various parts that were formerly part of the former Soviet Georgia, be it in Kazakhstan. So these Russians still have their Russian citizenship and still have their citizenship rights. And so when the West talks about the indivisibility of some territory of a newly pronounced republic, they have to keep in mind that the population of that republic is not its own.
Dmitry, what do you make of the comments from Victoria Nuland that were leaked a few days ago, a week ago or so, where she's basically implying that the U.S. is seeking to control events in Ukraine in what could be called to some degree a bit of a coup, if you will. What are your thoughts on that leaked recording of Victoria Nuland saying basically the EU should go f themselves?
Oh, well, everybody, zeroed in on the F word, but the really important message is that basically Nuland was coaching the ambassador on how to handle a couple of opposition figures who basically have turned out to be Western operatives. They've been coached for the job of taking over, and they sort of did. The reason I say sort of is because Nuland and everybody else has been completely blindsided by the fact that the people who are actually in power now are these neo-Nazis, these extreme right-wing, reactionary, bigoted people who use violence to get their way. Basically, they get the parliament in Kiev to legislate at gunpoint. And the government that has been thrust into office, if you will, lacks legitimacy, lacks popular support. Russian flags are going up all over the place, and I don't think it's long for this world.
Now, Dmitry, when I listen to Secretary of State John Kerry talking about the situation, and he's talking about, nobody in the 21st century would invade a country with under no pretense, seemingly completely oblivious to the events that in the last 5 or 10 years that America has engaged with, just stumbling into countries like Iraq with no pretense. He seems like he's talking from the 1950s or 1960s, and his voice is just reaching us like the light from a distant star. As if he never heard of WikiLeaks, he's never heard of the NSA reveals, he's never heard of the internet. Yet he's Secretary of State. During the Arab Spring, it was revealed, of course, that the Facebook revolution, as it was described, got traction because the head of Egypt at that time, Mubarak, had never heard of Facebook, had never heard of the internet, and yet so they had this revolution right under his nose. Is John Kerry on a Mubarak level disconnect with the reality of social media and the internet, and is this part of the collapse gap, Dmitry?
Oh, he's definitely fallen into the collapse gap. I'm from the state where he was junior senator for a really long time, alongside Ted Kennedy. And he's deteriorated over time. So now when John Kerry talks, he really needs subtitles. And the subtitles should always just say harumph, 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 harumph. There's nothing else to add. So you're absolutely right that, it's stunning that right now John Kerry opens his mouth and all kinds of things come out. And then you look for, say, the Russian reaction, right? And the Russian reaction is no comment. And that's pretty much how it's going to go.
All right, now, Dmitry, in the first half of the show, Stacey Herbert and I were talking about globalization and the end of globalization, and you see signs of the end of globalization in a lot of ways. Is this yet another factor into your thesis of collapse gap, and can you describe it as the end of globalization? Your thoughts?
Well, I think globalization is a bit of a disaster in some ways, particularly, it globalizes production very effectively. Production goes to the lowest cost place. but it doesn't globalize consumption. So consumption still goes to these formerly wealthy but now completely bankrupt, supposedly still rich societies. So there's a massive dislocation, and that has got to work itself out somehow, which is going to happen at some point. There's a positive side to globalization, which is now we live in a really, really mixed up world where bigotry and racism of the sort we're seeing in Ukraine, which is, you know, Ukraine for the Ukrainians sort of thing, doesn't really have a place. And I think people readily recognize that the world has moved on and that these people are basically trapped in this, you know, nationalist nature preserve of their own construction.
Fair enough. All right, Dmitry Orlov, we're out of time, but thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Dmitry Orlov. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.